On a cold Christmas Eve, an 8-year-old girl named Lila desperately trudges through a snowstorm, clutching her baby sister Molly, with the weight of the world on her shoulders. But she's not alone. Her loyal German shepherd, Ranger, limps beside her, guiding them through the fierce storm, unwavering in his devotion. But danger lurks, and their journey is far from over. What happens next will touch your heart and leave you in awe of the bond between this brave dog and his family. Watch the full story of courage, love, and protection unfold. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more heartwarming tales of loyalty. It was a Christmas night like no other. The world was blanketed under a thick layer of snow, the kind that made everything feel still, almost lifeless. The sky was a deep, endless black, pierced only by the occasional gust of wind howling through the trees. The town lay silent, the usual twinkling lights and cheerful carols replaced by the eerie sound of snow falling steadily, covering the earth like a soft, unforgiving shroud. In the midst of this frozen silence, a small figure moved through the storm. Lila Turner, just 8 years old, was clutching her baby sister Molly tightly to her chest, the infant wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket. Every step Lila took was heavy with fear, each breath sharper than the last as the cold gnawed at her bones. But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled, desperately trying to keep her footing in the deep snow. Behind her, Ranger, the old German shepherd, limped through the storm. His coat, once a rich blend of black and tan, was now speckled with white as the snow clung to him like a fragile prayer. The dog was slow, his front paw dragging slightly from an old injury, but there was no hesitation in his movements. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, followed every step Lila took. Ranger was the one constant in her life, the one who never left, no matter how dark the days had become. Lila knew she couldn't stop. Her arms, already sore from carrying Molly, felt like they might give out any second, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close. She couldn't think about the pain or the cold. She had to keep moving. Ahead of her, the world was a blur of white, but somewhere deep in her, she could still feel the pull of something, an instinct maybe, or sheer determination that kept her going. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of why she had to escape. Since Molly was born, everything had changed. The house, once filled with warmth and love, had turned into a place of constant fear. Her mother had died giving birth to Molly, and with her, their father's sanity had slipped away. Now, the man she once called father was just a shadow of someone she barely recognized. Lila had never imagined that Christmas would be like this. She had always imagined it would be full of joy, of lights, of laughter. But instead, it was just the cold, the snow, and the fear that seemed to cling to her every step. Each time she stumbled, each time the weight of the world felt too heavy, she could feel Ranger's presence behind her, steady and unwavering. Even though the dog was old and scarred, his loyalty had never wavered. Ranger was still her protector, still her guardian, and he wouldn't let her go. Not now, not ever. Just a little more, Lila whispered to herself, her voice shaking as she pulled Molly closer to her chest. Ellie, her baby sister, had started to whimper softly, and Lila's heart tightened. The baby's small body was trembling against hers, the cold creeping in, seeping through the thin blanket. Lila forced herself forward. Ranger's steps were slower now, but he kept pace, his eyes scanning the storm around them. It was as though the dog knew the danger they were in, knew that they had no choice but to move forward. Lila didn't look back. There was nothing behind her but the house they'd fled from, the man who had once been her father. Instead, she focused on what lay ahead, the path through the storm, and the promise of safety, no matter how far away it seemed. Lila knew they couldn't go back. She couldn't let Molly go back there, not ever. Ahead, the snow continued to fall, each flake disappearing as soon as it hit the ground. It was as though the world was erasing their tracks, keeping their secrets safe, keeping them hidden. But Lila felt something stir within her, a tiny flicker of hope, because somewhere out there, in the darkness and the snow, there had to be something better, something that would offer them the safety they desperately needed. And then, just as she began to lose hope, Ranger stopped. The dog's posture stiffened, and his ears perked up beneath the heavy weight of the snow. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She clutched Molly tighter to her chest and looked around. There was nothing. The storm had swallowed everything, every sound, every shape, until all that remained was the deafening rhythm of her own pulse. She whispered the dog's name, Ranger, but he didn't look back. Instead, the dog angled his head as though he was listening to something she couldn't hear, something beyond the range of human sense. Then, with a deep huff of determination, Ranger nudged her forward, pressing his shoulder against her leg to guide her. Lila hesitated for just a second, and then she obeyed. Ranger, her steadfast companion, had never steered her wrong. As they trudged forward, their footprints were quickly buried by the falling snow, and the world around them began to close in again. But for the first time that night, Lila felt a flicker of warmth, something deep inside telling her that, for now, they were safe. She didn't know what lay ahead, but at least for this moment they weren't alone. Lila's legs felt like they were made of stone, each step heavier than the last. The biting cold seeped into her bones, draining her strength with every breath she took. Her boots sunk deep into the snow, and with each step she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Molly was depending on her. She looked down at the small bundle in her arms, her baby sister Molly wrapped in a thin blanket, barely moving. The baby's breath was shallow, her face pale and flushed from the cold. Lila could feel Molly's small body trembling against hers, and with every shiver, her heart broke a little more. Lila's arms were sore, aching from the strain of holding her sister, but the pain in her heart was far greater. Her mother was gone. And her father, he wasn't the man she remembered. The man who used to be kind, the man who used to laugh with them, had disappeared along with her mother's death. All that remained was a shadow of him, a man consumed by grief and anger, a man who hurt the ones he should have protected. Lila knew deep down that only she could save Molly. If she didn't, who would? Her legs were giving out, the cold biting at her skin, and exhaustion wrapped around her like an iron chain. Her body screamed for rest, for warmth, but she couldn't afford to stop, not until they were safe. She couldn't stop thinking of her father's anger, of the harsh words he had shouted at them before they fled. The sound of his fury still echoed in her mind like thunder rolling through her soul. And then, just when she thought she couldn't go on any longer, Ranger nudged her forward, his head lowered, his eyes focused ahead, guiding her through the storm. The old German shepherd was slowing down, limping with every step, his paws dragging in the snow, but he was there. He wasn't going to leave them. Not now. Not ever. Lila looked down at Ranger. His fur was matted with snow, his body trembling from the cold and pain, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. The loyalty in Ranger's gaze was unwavering. He had always been there, through the good times and the bad. Even when her mother passed, even when her father became someone she no longer recognized, Ranger had stayed. He had never left their side. Lila's heart swelled with gratitude and love for the dog. In a world that had become so cold and unforgiving, Ranger was the only thing that had not changed, the only thing that still cared. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going, but as long as Ranger was with her, she felt like she wasn't alone. She stumbled again, her foot slipping in the snow. This time her body didn't catch her. She fell hard, the cold snow biting into her skin, knocking the wind out of her lungs. Molly let out a weak cry, her small body pressing against Lila's. The weight of the world crashed down on her, and for a brief moment Lila wanted to give up. She wanted to let the darkness take over, to sink into the snow and never have to feel this pain again. But then she heard Ranger's low whine. The sound was desperate, almost as if the dog was calling her, urging her to get up. Slowly, Lila pushed herself to her hands and knees. Her body ached with every movement, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Ranger was there, nudging her gently with his nose, urging her to keep going. His eyes locked onto hers, a silent promise to never leave her side, no matter how bad things got. With a shaky breath, Lila pulled herself to her feet. She clutched Molly tightly in her arms, and with Ranger at her side, she took another step, then another. And then finally, they were moving again. The storm raged around them, the snow falling harder than ever. But Lila felt something stir inside her. Maybe it was the hope that Ranger brought with him. Maybe it was the love she felt for her sister. Maybe it was the sheer determination to keep her family safe. But whatever it was, it pushed her forward step by step. And with each step, the weight on her shoulders grew lighter. She wasn't alone. As long as she had Ranger, she could keep going. The storm seemed endless. Snowflakes whipped through the air, biting at Lila's skin, and the wind howled like a distant scream. But there was a rhythm to their steps now, a steady pace that Lila clung to as if she could outrun the world itself. Her body was screaming with exhaustion, but she ignored it. She had to keep moving. Molly's tiny form felt like a heavy weight in her arms, but her sister's warmth was the only thing keeping Lila going. And Ranger, her faithful companion, was still by her side, limping but determined, each step a quiet act of defiance against the storm. Lila's focus was fixed on the path ahead, her eyes searching for any sign of safety, any place that could offer them refuge. Her legs were burning, each step a battle. She didn't know how much longer she could last. The snow had completely covered their footprints now, erasing any trace of their flight. The world felt empty, swallowed whole by the blizzard, and for a moment Lila wondered if they were the last living souls in the storm. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of light. A single beam of yellow from a car's headlights cut through the storm, bright against the gray shadows of the forest. The sound of tires crunching on snow reached her ears, faint but unmistakable. Lila stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Was it a stranger, a rescuer, or someone else entirely? Ranger immediately stopped beside her, his body stiffening as he sensed something unfamiliar. He growled softly, but Lila could feel the tension in his muscles, the same protective instinct that had never let her down. Before Lila could make a move, the vehicle stopped and the engine cut out. The headlights flashed briefly, momentarily blinding her in the darkness. Then the door opened with a creak, and a tall figure stepped out, his silhouette barely visible against the flurry of snow. "Hey!" the voice called out, deep but warm, cutting through the wind. "Are you okay?" Lila froze. She couldn't see his face, but she could hear the concern in his voice, the urgency. It was the first time she'd heard someone else speak to her, other than the harsh voice of her father. Before she could respond, the man took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat and a police officer's badge on his chest. The badge caught the dim light from his cruiser, making him appear almost like a beacon in the storm. "My name's Officer Alex Parker," he said, his voice softer now, closer. "I'm here to help." Lila's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to run, to keep going. She didn't trust anyone. But then she saw Ranger. His head tilted in that way he did when he was sensing someone, his ears perked up, and there was something in his eyes that made her pause. Ranger wasn't growling anymore. He was standing still, watching Alex with a quiet intensity, as though waiting for something. Lila had learned long ago that when Ranger trusted someone, she could too. She glanced down at her sister Molly, still wrapped tightly in her arms, her tiny face cold and pale. Her heart ached. She had no choice but to trust him. She had no choice but to let someone help them, even if it meant letting go of the control she had desperately tried to maintain. Alex stopped a few feet away, looking at them with a careful, understanding expression. His eyes were full of compassion, but there was also a quiet strength there that made Lila feel as though she could finally breathe again. "You're not alone," Alex said gently, his eyes flicking from Lila to Molly, then to Ranger, who stood steady and calm. "You're safe now." Lila's throat tightened as she tried to hold back tears. She didn't know why, but in that moment she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The storm still raged around them, but here, in the presence of this stranger, this officer, there was a sudden flicker of hope. I don't know where to go," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, taking a step closer, but careful not to alarm her. "We'll get you somewhere safe. Just follow me." He glanced over his shoulder at the car, and then at Ranger, who had now lowered his head, seemingly at ease with the officer's presence. "You've got a good dog there. He's been looking out for you." Lila felt the truth in his words. Ranger had been more than a dog. He had been a protector, a constant presence in the storm. And now, for the first time that night, Ranger wasn't leading them into the unknown. He was guiding them towards safety. Lila nodded, her body exhausted but her resolve stronger than ever. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while she felt like they might actually make it through. Alex gently guided Lila and Molly toward the police cruiser, his hand extended in a silent gesture of reassurance. The wind howled around them, but inside the warm glow of the cruiser's headlights, the storm seemed a distant memory. As Lila stepped closer, she felt the weight of the night bearing down on her, the exhaustion, the fear, the cold, but there was also a flicker of relief. She had made it this far. With Ranger beside them, she wasn't alone anymore. Ranger limped slowly behind them, his body barely moving with the same strength it once had. His fur was matted with snow, his breathing ragged and shallow, but his eyes never left Lila and Molly. The old dog was tired, the years of service and hardship catching up with him, but he would not abandon them. Not now, not when they needed him most. Alex opened the back door of the cruiser, motioning for them to climb in. "We'll get you out of this storm," he said softly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We'll figure things out, I promise." Lila hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Ranger as he carefully climbed into the back seat beside them. His body was trembling, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. His front paw still dragged slightly, evidence of the old injury that had never fully healed. Yet, despite the pain, Ranger settled down beside Lila, his head resting against her leg as though he were taking comfort from her presence. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. Lila slid into the seat, holding Molly close, her heart racing as she finally allowed herself a moment of relief. She glanced at Ranger, his golden eyes looking up at her with unwavering loyalty. "You're okay," she whispered, as though trying to convince herself as much as him. But she couldn't deny the truth in his eyes. He had been by her side through everything, from the joy of her mother's smile to the darkness of the past few months. Alex closed the door behind them, then climbed into the front seat. As he started the engine, the warmth of the cruiser enveloped them, a small comfort in the freezing night. But there was no mistaking the urgency in the officer's movements. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, briefly catching a glimpse of Ranger and the girls before he turned his attention back to the road ahead. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the engine purring and the soft hum of the heater. Lila stared out of the window, watching the snow swirl past them in a chaotic dance, her mind racing. She had to say something that had been weighing on her for so long. She had no choice now. She swallowed hard, her throat tight as she spoke. I don't know where to start," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But my dad, he's not who he used to be after Mom died." She trailed off, her chest tightening as the flood of memories came rushing back. Ranger shifted beside her, pressing his head gently against her side as though offering silent comfort. "After Mom died, things got really bad," Lila continued, her words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. Dad started drinking. He wasn't the same. He started getting angry. At me, at Molly, at the whole world. He'd shout at us. He'd hit things. And sometimes he would hit us too. Her voice trembled with the weight of the confession. I was scared, but Molly was even more scared. She didn't understand what was happening. She was just a baby. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of her father's rage, the yelling, the destruction. The night she and Molly fled kept replaying in her mind. The terror in her father's eyes as he shouted at them. The pounding of his fists against the walls, and the bone-chilling fear that had driven her to take Molly and run. Alex's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. Lila could feel his silent support, the way his gaze softened as he absorbed her words. There was no judgment, no question in his eyes, just the quiet understanding of someone who had seen pain, but also knew how to offer help. Lila took a shaky breath, her heart heavy with the weight of her confession. I didn't know where to go, I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get Molly out of there. I couldn't let him hurt her. Alex nodded slowly, his voice calm. You did the right thing, he said simply. You both did. You're safe now. Lila didn't respond, but she felt a small flicker of hope. They were safe. For now, at least. The cruiser continued to cut through the storm, its headlights illuminating the dark road ahead, but Lila couldn't shake the unease in her chest. They were headed to safety, yes, but what would happen when they got there? Would things ever be the same again? Would they ever feel like they had a home again? The cruiser continued its steady course through the storm, the tires crunching against the snow-covered road. Inside, the warmth of the vehicle contrasted sharply with the biting cold of the night, and yet, Lila felt a deep chill inside her. She was exhausted. Physically, emotionally, every part of her aching, but there was something else, too. A sense of uncertainty that crept into her chest and tightened around her heart. She glanced down at Molly, who was now asleep in her arms, her small face pale but peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, Molly was safe. For the first time in a long time, Lila wasn't afraid. But still, something lingered in the back of her mind. Where would they go next? She had taken Molly out of harm's way, but what about the future? Could she give Molly a better life, free from the pain of their past? The thought was interrupted when Lila's fingers brushed against something inside her coat pocket. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a folded piece of paper, thin, fragile, the edges slightly worn as if it had been carried with care for a long time. Lila pulled the paper out, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but hurried. The words scrawled across the page with the urgency of someone trying to say something important in a short amount of time. If you ever feel lost, follow Ranger. He will take you home. The words hit her like a wave. She read them again, slower this time, her eyes filling with tears. He will take you home. It was a message from her mother, from the woman who had given everything for Lila and Molly, the woman who had died when giving birth to Molly. Lila could almost hear her mother's voice in the words, a soft whisper in the back of her mind, telling her that Ranger, her protector, her constant companion, would guide them through the darkness. Her mother had known this would happen. She had known that Lila would be lost, scared, and alone one day, and she had trusted Ranger to be the one to bring her home. Lila's breath hitched as she held the paper in her hands, her fingers tracing over the words as if she could feel her mother's presence again, like the warmth of her touch was still there. Her mother had believed in Ranger, had trusted the dog to guide them, to bring them home. And somehow, in that moment, Lila believed it too. The weight of her mother's love and the trust she had placed in Ranger flooded over her, filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Ranger wasn't just a dog, he was more than that. He was family. He was a promise, one that had been made long before this night, a promise that Lila could still feel, still hear, even after everything had changed. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now, feeling the ache in her chest slowly give way to something lighter, something warmer. Her mother's love hadn't disappeared. It was still there, wrapped in these words, wrapped in the loyalty of Ranger, who had never left their side. Damned. Lila took a deep breath, holding the paper tightly in her hand. She was not alone. Ranger was with her. Alex glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the way Lila was gripping the paper. He said nothing, but his eyes softened. He had seen the bond between the two of them, between Lila and Ranger. It was more than just a connection, it was a lifeline. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the storm outside, as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Lila wiped the tears from her eyes, looking down at Molly again, who remained peacefully asleep in her arms. The storm outside may have been relentless, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Lila felt a spark of hope. Her mother had left her a way out, and now Ranger would guide her. The sound of the storm outside seemed to fill the space in the cruiser, but inside there was a heavy silence. Lila held the piece of paper from her mother, her fingers trembling as she kept it pressed tightly to her chest. She didn't know what it was, whether it was the memory of her mother or the quiet, steady presence of Ranger beside her. But something had shifted inside her. The world outside might still be cold and uncertain, but in this moment she was beginning to feel the weight of hope again. She wasn't lost. Not anymore. Alex kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were far from it. The glow of the headlights caught the swirling snowflakes, and for a moment he couldn't shake the thought that something had changed tonight, not just for Lila and Molly, but for him too. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, catching sight of Lila's tear-streaked face, the small bundle of Molly sleeping soundly in her arms, and the steady, ever-watchful gaze of Ranger. The dog hadn't budged, his head resting against Lila's leg as if to say, "I'll protect you until the end." He had seen many things during his time in the force. He'd been a part of rescues, saved countless lives, and had witnessed the heartache of families torn apart. But this was different. He hadn't signed up for this kind of change, for this kind of responsibility. Lila and Molly were vulnerable, desperate. The way they had fled from danger, from a life of violence and pain, was evident in every line of Lila's face. And in Ranger's eyes, Alex saw the kind of loyalty that most people could only dream of. He'd read the note from Lila's mother earlier, the one she had clutched tightly in her hand. "If you ever feel lost, follow Ranger. He will take you home." It was a simple message, but it was enough to make him pause. The fact that Lila's mother had trusted Ranger to guide her daughter to safety spoke volumes. She had known that one day this dog, this loyal protector, would be more than just a companion. He would be her daughter's salvation. But the more Alex thought about it, the more he realized there was no way he could take them to a shelter or center. They needed more than that. Lila and Molly needed something no one could give them in a cold, sterile place full of strangers. Without saying a word, Alex made up his mind. He pulled the cruiser off the road and down a narrow, snow-covered lane. The headlights swept over the dark, quiet landscape, casting long shadows on the trees that lined the path. Lila glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and hesitation. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still shaky, but stronger than before. Alex looked back at her in the rearview mirror, offering a faint, reassuring smile. "Not to a shelter," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm taking you home." Lila's eyes widened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a spark of hope flickered in her chest. "You—" She didn't know what to say, but the feeling of relief was overwhelming. "You're not taking us to a shelter?" Alex shook his head. "You and Molly have been through enough. You don't need to be surrounded by strangers tonight. You need a place where you can rest, feel safe. I have a cabin up ahead. It's warm and it's far enough out of the way that you'll be able to breathe." Lila's heart swelled, her hand tightening around Molly. "Thank you," she whispered, barely above a breath. Alex didn't respond immediately, his mind elsewhere. As the cruiser slowly rolled forward, he found himself thinking about how this night would change everything. He'd been alone for so long, his heart and mind consumed with grief after the loss of his wife and son. But this moment, this choice, felt different. It wasn't just about rescuing two strangers from the storm. It was about something deeper. It was about offering a family, something Alex hadn't even realized he had been missing. Lila, Molly, and Ranger had found him tonight, but in a strange way, he was finding something too. He was finding a reason to move forward, a reason to fight against the grief that had kept him locked in the past. As the cruiser came to a slow stop in front of the small cabin, Alex turned off the engine. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin was warm and inviting. Alex stepped out of the car, walking around to open the door for Lila and Molly. He helped them out, guiding them toward the door. Ranger followed, tail low but steady as ever. As Alex opened the door and led them inside, he glanced back at the storm still raging outside. The world outside was still dark and cold, but here was warmth, a sense of safety. They were safe, for now. The warmth inside the cabin was like nothing Lila had ever known. The crackling fire in the stone fireplace cast a soft glow over the room, filling it with a sense of comfort that felt almost foreign after everything they had been through. The small space was simple, rustic even, but it felt like a sanctuary. There was no fear, no danger looming, just silence and the soft hum of the heater. Lila sat down on the couch with Molly nestled in her arms. The baby's tiny form seemed to fit perfectly against her chest, her breath soft and steady. Lila stroked her sister's hair, her fingers trembling slightly from the emotional strain of the night. She had always been the protector, the one who took care of Molly, but tonight felt different. She had kept them both alive, kept them safe. But now, for the first time, they were truly safe. But even in this warmth, Lila couldn't shake the gnawing unease in the pit of her stomach. The storm still raged outside, the wind howling against the walls of the cabin, and the memory of their flight, the terror of her father's anger, the fear of the unknown kept creeping back into her mind. Lila was trying to relax, trying to allow herself to feel the relief of finally finding refuge, but her mind refused to let go of the fear. She had left everything behind, her home, her life before the storm, and she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. How long would they be safe? Could they really start over? Molly stirred in her arms, her tiny face scrunching up as she began to wake. Lila gently rocked her, murmuring soft words of reassurance, though she wasn't sure if she believed them herself. "Everything's going to be okay, Molly," Lila whispered. "We're safe now. We'll be okay." The door opened, and Alex stepped in from the cold, brushing snow from his jacket. He glanced over at Lila and Molly, then down at Ranger, who was still standing by the door, his body tense and his eyes searching the room. The dog had not left their side since they arrived, his loyalty unwavering despite his age and exhaustion. Ranger's movements were slow, each step heavy with pain, but he refused to settle down. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze fixed on Lila and Molly, as though he was still guarding them, still watching over them, even in the safety of the cabin. Alex knelt down next to Ranger, gently running a hand over the dog's fur. He could feel the tension in the dog's body, the slight tremble beneath the surface. Ranger was hurt, and it was clear he had been through a lot. But the dog's eyes were still sharp, still protective. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "I'll take him to the vet," Alex said quietly, glancing at Lila. "He needs to be checked out, get some rest." Lila nodded, though she couldn't bear the thought of Ranger being away from them. She knew the dog was old, and his body had taken a beating over the years, but he was more than just a pet. He was family. And the thought of him being in pain, alone in a strange place, felt unbearable. "He'll be okay, right?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex smiled gently, trying to offer comfort. He's strong, Lila. He's a fighter, and we'll make sure he gets the care he needs. Lila's heart ached, but she knew Alex was right. Ranger had been there for her and Molly when no one else was, and now it was time for them to be there for him. As Alex prepared to leave, Ranger stepped closer to Lila, resting his head against her leg. His eyes met hers, full of trust and gratitude. Lila knelt down to stroke his fur, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Thank you, Ranger. You saved us." Ranger gave a soft whine, and Lila felt the warmth of his presence fill the room, pushing away the lingering doubts and fears. This was home. For now, they were safe, and Ranger was still there. His unwavering loyalty the only thing that mattered. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them, and for a fleeting moment it felt as though everything was finally falling into place. Lila and Molly were safe. The storm raged outside but no longer felt as threatening. Ranger had been settled, resting by the fire after Alex had promised to take him to the vet. It seemed like everything was finally starting to calm down, that they could finally breathe again. But that peace was short-lived. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. A heavy pounding on the door echoed through the small cabin, sharp and jarring against the quiet hum of the storm outside. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She froze, staring at the door as if she could will the sound to stop. It wasn't just any knock. It was the kind of knock that made your blood run cold, the kind that signaled danger. Alex stood immediately, his hand instinctively going to the gun holstered at his side. His calm demeanor faltered for a second, and he turned to Lila, his voice low and steady. "Stay here," he said before heading toward the door. Lila's heart raced. She knew who it was. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Her father had come for her. The door creaked open and Alex peered out into the night. Standing in the doorway, swaying slightly, was Lila's father, Caleb Turner. His clothes were disheveled, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and grief. He reeked of alcohol, his breath sharp and foul as he stood there glaring at Alex. "What the hell is going on here?" Caleb growled, his words slurring. "Give me my daughter, now!" Lila's stomach dropped. She could feel her knees shaking, but she forced herself to stay silent. She knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't let her fear show. She could hear Ranger's low growl from across the room, his body tense, as though sensing the danger that stood just outside the door. Alex stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm not giving you anything," he said, his eyes never leaving Caleb. "Your daughter is staying here tonight. She's safe now. You've caused enough damage already." Caleb's face contorted in rage, his fists clenching. "You don't know anything. You don't know what I've been through. You think you can just take my daughter from me? You think I'm going to let some stranger keep her? He was cut off by Ranger's sharp bark. The dog's body was tense, his teeth visible as he stood between Lila and Caleb. The growl that came from the German shepherd's throat wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. Ranger was prepared to defend her with everything he had, even if it meant facing Lila's father head-on. For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind outside, the storm's fury crashing against the windows. Lila could feel her heart racing, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. This was it. The moment she had feared, the moment when her father would come to take her back, to drag her back into the hell she had barely escaped. Alex didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the door, his body blocking Caleb's path. "You're not taking her," Alex repeated, his voice unyielding. "You're done. The law will be involved from here on out. If you don't leave right now, I'll make sure you regret it." Caleb's hand twitched at his side, and for a terrifying moment, Lila thought he might reach for something. The gun. But then the rage in his eyes flickered, and he backed away. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice shaking with anger and something else, fear. "You'll regret this." With that, he turned and stormed off into the night, disappearing into the snowstorm that still raged around them. The door slowly closed behind him, and the cabin fell into silence once again. Lila's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around Molly. She could feel her body shaking with the aftermath of the confrontation, her heart still pounding in her chest. Alex stood by the door watching her. His expression softened, but there was still tension in the air. Ranger slowly moved over to Lila's side, nudging her gently with his nose, offering the comfort that only he could provide. "You're safe now," Alex said softly, walking over and sitting beside her. "No one's taking you anywhere. You're with me now, with Ranger." Lila nodded, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. Her father's words still rang in her ears. He wasn't done. He wouldn't give up so easily. And that thought kept her up the rest of the night. The night fell heavy around them, thick with the sound of the howling wind and the unsettling silence that followed Caleb's departure. Lila sat on the couch, still holding Molly close, as if the baby's warmth could somehow shield her from the terrifying weight of her father's threat. Ranger, despite his age and injuries, was by her side, his eyes watching the door, waiting for any sign of danger. But danger in this case had never felt so close. Caleb wasn't just a shadow in her past. He was still very much a threat to their safety. He had promised her he wouldn't give up. And somehow, deep down, Lila knew he wouldn't. The cabin felt too small now. Alex stood by the window, his figure outlined by the dim glow of the lights outside. He was tense, his jaw clenched, his hands still gripping the doorframe. He had faced countless confrontations in his years on the force, but this one was different. He wasn't just dealing with a suspect. He wasn't just following orders. He was facing a man driven by grief, a father who had lost everything and wasn't willing to lose his daughter too. "Are you all right?" Alex asked, turning back to Lila. Lila nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes was enough to tell him she wasn't. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice trembled. "He won't stop, will he?" Alex didn't answer immediately. He just moved to the other side of the room, pacing slowly, trying to think. He had to protect them. Lila, Molly, and Ranger, they were under his care now. And it wasn't just the physical threat Caleb posed, it was the psychological hold he had over Lila. But Alex knew one thing for sure. Caleb's threats were only words. He couldn't hurt them anymore. Suddenly the silence was broken by a faint sound, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. Alex's body stiffened. Lila's breath caught in her throat. He moved swiftly toward the door, peering through the window. There, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, he saw the outline of a man, Caleb. He was back. His coat was soaked, his face flushed with anger, his eyes wild. Ranger growled softly in the corner, his body tensing. "Stay inside," Alex murmured to Lila, his voice low and steady. "Stay behind me. I'll handle this." But Lila was already standing, her gaze fixed on the door. Ranger followed her, his movements slow but determined. Lila knew that Ranger wouldn't let her face her father alone. The dog, though weary, still stood ready to fight if it meant protecting her. Lila didn't speak as Alex opened the door, but there was a new resolve in her eyes. She wouldn't let her father take her back. Not again. Not ever. Caleb's voice cut through the silence as soon as Alex opened the door. "Lila, come with me," he spat, his voice laced with fury. "You're not staying here with him. You belong with me." Lila's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. "No," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Caleb's eyes flickered with something darker now, something that made Alex's hand instinctively reach for the gun at his hip. But it wasn't the gun that would protect them. It was the steady presence of Ranger standing just behind Lila, his fur bristling, his teeth bared. The old dog was ready, despite the limp in his step and the pain in his body. "You're making a mistake, Lila." Caleb's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're mine." Ranger's growl deepened, louder now, almost vibrating through the floor. Caleb froze. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze too, the only sound the dog's low rumble, like a distant thunderstorm ready to erupt. Alex took a step forward, his presence solid and unyielding. "She's not going anywhere with you, Caleb." His voice was firm, cutting through the tension. "You've done enough." The storm outside raged on, but inside the silence between them was palpable, thick with unresolved anger and years of pain. Caleb's eyes darted between Alex, Ranger, and Lila, but his body stiffened when he saw the unshakable resolve in his daughter's eyes. "This isn't over," Caleb snarled, turning away. "You'll regret this." He stormed off into the storm again, disappearing into the night, his words echoing in the cabin long after he was gone. Lila stood motionless by the door, her body trembling but her eyes clear. Ranger slowly approached her, nuzzling her leg as if to say, "I won't let you go through this alone." Alex closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Lila's voice was quiet, but steady. "He'll be back," she said, her gaze distant, as if already preparing for the next confrontation. Alex didn't respond immediately, but in his heart he knew one thing: this wasn't over. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, Alex had made a promise. He wouldn't let Caleb tear this family apart again. The cabin felt as though it were closing in on them. Lila stood frozen by the door, her heart racing in the eerie silence that followed her father's departure. Ranger was still by her side, the dog's gentle nuzzle a small comfort, but the storm outside wasn't the only storm Lila had to face. She could feel it brewing inside, the storm of fear, anger, and desperation that Caleb carried with him. She knew he wasn't done. Alex stood across the room, his back pressed against the door, his mind racing. He knew what Caleb was capable of. He'd seen it before. A man drowning in grief, spiraling into violence, holding on to control in the only way he knew how. But tonight, Alex couldn't let that happen. He had already promised Lila that she and Molly would be safe. He wouldn't let Caleb tear this family apart. Just as Alex began to relax his guard, a sound from outside the door shattered the stillness. The unmistakable scrape of boots crunching through the snow, drawing closer, heavier, angrier. Lila's breath caught. She felt it before she heard it. The familiar, terrifying presence of her father, returning with a force that made the ground beneath her feel unstable. Before Alex could reach the door again, there was a deafening bang. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the cabin, so loud and sudden that it sent a jolt of panic through Lila's body. She didn't even have time to react before the door exploded open. There he was, Caleb, wild-eyed and trembling with fury. His hand was shaking as he gripped the gun tightly, the barrel pointing straight at Alex, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You think you can just take her from me?" Caleb snarled, his voice thick with rage, his words barely controlled. "I'll make sure you regret this. You don't take what's mine." Lila's heart dropped as she saw her father, consumed by anger, pointing the gun toward Alex. The fear she had felt earlier now turned into a flood of cold terror. Her father was lost in his rage. He didn't care about the consequences. All that mattered was that he felt powerless, and Lila was the only thing he could still control. Before Lila could even move, Ranger sprang into action. The old dog, despite his injuries, lunged forward, barking furiously. His body slammed into Caleb, knocking him off balance just as the gun went off again. The bullet went wild, grazing the wall behind them. Ranger, undeterred by the close call, growled fiercely, his teeth bared as he stood between Lila and her father, a physical barrier that Caleb had never expected. The dog's protective stance was unwavering. This was his family, and he would defend them at any cost. Caleb stumbled back, shocked, but the fury didn't leave his eyes. He regained his footing, glaring at Ranger, his hand shaking as he raised the gun once more. Lila's body was frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. "Stay back," Alex said sharply, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. He knew how dangerous Caleb was. He had to act fast. Ranger barked again, a low growl vibrating in his chest as he stood firm, a protector in every sense of the word. Ranger wasn't backing down, no matter the danger. Caleb's eyes flickered between the gun and the dog, his rage bubbling to the surface. "I'm not going to let you take her," he spat, his voice a guttural snarl. "You can't have her. She's mine." Alex stepped closer, keeping his eyes locked on Caleb. "No," he said, his voice firm, unshaken. "You're not taking her. She's not your possession anymore." But Caleb was too far gone. The gun wavered in his hand, and Alex saw the dangerous gleam in his eyes. The man was ready to pull the trigger again. In that moment, Ranger's instincts took over. With one final desperate bark, the German shepherd lunged forward again, this time going straight for Caleb's arm. The dog's teeth sank into the sleeve of his coat, and Caleb screamed, flinching back as the gun fell to the floor with a loud clatter. Caleb staggered, the gun slipping from his grasp as he was knocked off balance. He looked down at Ranger, the dog still holding him back, refusing to let him get any closer to Lila. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving with frustration and pain. Lila blinked, her mind scrambling. This was the moment. This was where everything would change. Caleb wasn't just a threat anymore. He was falling apart, losing control, and now it was time for Alex to make a choice. Time seemed to freeze in that instant. The tension was thick enough to suffocate, each heartbeat louder than the next. Caleb was barely standing, his breath ragged, his face twisted with anger and desperation. Ranger was still firmly positioned between Lila and her father, the dog's teeth clenched in Caleb's coat, refusing to let go. Lila's heart raced in her chest. She could barely breathe, but she couldn't take her eyes off the scene unfolding before her. Her father, the man who had once been her protector, was now a dangerous threat. Ranger, the one who had always been there for her, was the only thing standing between them now. Caleb staggered back, his body were wobbling, but his eyes were locked on Alex. He was shaking, his fingers twitching, still gripping the gun that had fallen to the floor. He was unstable, his emotions too far gone to think rationally. The gun was still within reach, and Caleb's finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. Alex's eyes never left Caleb. He took another slow step forward, his body tense, every muscle coiled with the knowledge that this was the moment where things could go horribly wrong. The man in front of him was unhinged, unpredictable. Caleb was no longer the father of Lila he once knew. He was a broken, angry shell of a man consumed by grief and rage. Alex's hand hovered over his gun. He could hear Ranger's growl in the back of his mind, the sound of the dog's deep, unwavering loyalty, the warning that this was a moment where things would escalate if he didn't act. With a breath so steady it felt like time itself was holding its breath, Alex drew his weapon. Lila's eyes went wide, her heart skipping a beat as she watched him, but there was no turning back now. She knew this was the only way to protect Molly, to protect herself. "Get down," Alex shouted, his voice a sharp command as he fired. The gunshot rang out deafening, a single sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. The force of the shot struck Caleb's shoulder, sending him reeling back, his body crashing into the wall. He let out a strangled cry of pain, his hand instinctively clutching the wound as he dropped to his knees, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. Ranger immediately stepped forward, his body moving protectively between Lila and Caleb. The dog was relentless, unyielding in his role as protector. Despite the wounds and weariness that weighed him down, Ranger would never back away from his charge. His body was tense, but he remained solid, guarding the sisters from the man who had once been their protector, but was now their greatest threat. Caleb, still reeling from the shock of the gunshot, gritted his teeth. His bloodied hand trembled as it pressed against his shoulder, but his eyes still burned with fury. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned toward Alex, the anger still there despite the pain. "You'll pay for this," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice hoarse, but there was no strength behind it anymore. His body sagged in defeat. The rage that had driven him to this point was beginning to dissipate, replaced by the reality of his failure. Alex stepped back, keeping his gun trained on Caleb, but he didn't fire again. There was no need. Caleb was no longer a threat. Lila stood frozen, her hands still gripping Molly tightly, her body shaking from the chaos. She had never imagined this moment, never thought she'd have to make a choice like this. To choose safety over family. To watch the man who had been her father fall. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, she knew she had done the right thing. Ranger, Alex, and Molly, they were all she had left. Her family wasn't about blood anymore. It was about those who stood beside her, those who protected her without question. Alex holstered his weapon, stepping closer to Lila and Molly, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe now. This is over." Ranger slowly lowered his guard, but his eyes never left Caleb. The dog had done his part. He had protected his family. Alex turned to Lila, his gaze full of compassion. "This isn't over yet, but you're not alone. We'll make sure he can't hurt you again." Lila nodded, her lips trembling as she wiped away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. She had faced her fear, she had faced her father, and won. Lila stood there, her breath shaky, her hands still trembling as they clutched Molly tightly to her chest. The sound of the storm outside was muffled by the thick walls of the cabin, but inside, the weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She had never thought it would come to this. To face her father, to watch him crumble, and to realize that the man who once held so much power over her life was now just a shadow of who he used to be. For years she had been afraid of him, afraid of his anger, his outbursts, the unpredictability that had come after her mother died. She had always tried to be the good daughter, the one who kept quiet, the one who stayed out of his way. But tonight, something had changed. Lila had made a choice that was not just for her but for Molly, for Ranger, and for the future she could now see ahead of her. Her father had come to take her back, to force her to live under his control once again, but Lila wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't the scared child who cowered in the corner, hoping the yelling would stop. She was stronger now, stronger than she had ever been, because she had faced her fear and refused to let it control her. She wasn't going back to that life. She wouldn't let Molly go back either. Looking at her father, sitting there, defeated and broken, Lila realized something she hadn't before. Her father wasn't invincible. His anger and pain had consumed him, and in the end, it had turned him into a man she didn't recognize. He was a ghost of the father she had once loved, a father who couldn't protect her, who couldn't even protect himself. Lila's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time she felt no fear. She wasn't angry, she wasn't sad, she was free. "No, Dad," she said softly but firmly. Her voice was steady, cutting through the heavy silence that followed the chaos. "I'm not going back with you. I'm staying here, with Alex, with Ranger." Caleb didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered between Lila and Ranger, who stood motionless, eyes still locked on the man who had once been their protector. Ranger's presence, unwavering and unyielding, made all the difference. The dog stood like a wall between Lila and her father, a silent reminder that the bond between them was stronger than any threat. Lila swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper but full of conviction. "You're not my father anymore. You've changed." Alex watched from the doorway, his eyes soft but filled with understanding. He had seen the transformation in Lila over the past few hours. She had gone from a scared little girl to a young woman, brave enough to stand her ground, to protect her sister and herself. Alex had no words to say, but in his heart, he knew. Lila was no longer the frightened child she had been when the night started. She had grown up in ways that no one could have predicted. forced to grow up fast, but still holding on to the kindness and courage that had always been there, hidden beneath the fear. Lila turned back to Ranger, who was still by her side, his body a comforting presence in the chaos of the night. The dog's head rested gently on her knee, as if to reassure her that everything would be okay now. She ran her fingers through his fur, a silent promise of gratitude. Ranger had been the constant in her life, the one who had never abandoned her, the one who had stayed when everything else had fallen apart. "I'm not going back," Lila said again, this time with more confidence. "I'm staying with my family." Alex stepped closer to her, his voice low but full of pride. "You did well, Lila," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think." Lila nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. The storm had passed, but the weight of what she had just done would linger in her heart for a long time. She had made her choice, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she could finally breathe. The days that followed were slow and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night they had fled from. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow and a world that felt frozen in time. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, a warmth that Lila hadn't felt in a long time. They were safe, for now, and that safety was all she needed. Ranger, the steadfast protector, had been taken to the local veterinary clinic as soon as the adrenaline had worn off. His body was covered in bruises and old injuries that had never healed properly. Alex had insisted on getting him the medical attention he needed, even though the old dog's strength had been fading with every passing year. Lila had been hesitant to let him go, her heart aching at the thought of Ranger being left alone. But Alex assured her that he would be well cared for and that this was the best chance for him to recover fully. And so, Lila had reluctantly agreed. A few days later, Ranger returned, much to Lila's relief. His fur was now clean and freshly groomed, his body still weak, but his spirit intact. He limped slightly, his movements slower than usual, but there was a noticeable spark in his eyes, the same loyalty, the same fire that had always guided him. When Alex opened the door to let him in, Ranger immediately shuffled toward Lila, his tail wagging weakly as he limped into the cabin. Lila rushed to meet him, dropping to her knees to greet him. "Ranger!" she cried, her voice filled with emotion. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The dog's warmth was like a lifeline, grounding her in the present moment. The fear, the uncertainty, everything faded away the moment she felt Ranger there beside her. The dog nuzzled her gently, as if he was reassuring her that he was okay, that he would always be there for her. Lila's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude, tears of relief. For all the fear she had carried in her heart, Ranger had always been her constant, her protector, the one who never gave up. Alex watched quietly from the doorway, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. He had seen Ranger's unwavering loyalty firsthand, and now, seeing the bond between the dog and Lila was a reminder of the depth of love and trust that existed between them. "You two are something else, you know that?" Alex said, his voice soft but filled with admiration. Lila looked up at him, her face glowing with the kind of peace that she hadn't known in years. "He's my family, Alex," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's all I have left." Alex nodded, his expression softening. He had always known the power of loyalty and love, but seeing it play out so intensely between Lila and Ranger filled him with a sense of awe. The dog had risked his life to protect Lila and Molly, and now it was clear that Ranger was not just a pet. He was a protector in the truest sense of the word. Lila continued to sit by Ranger's side, her hand gently stroking his fur as she whispered soft words of gratitude. She could feel the bond between them growing even stronger, the way his presence soothed her, the way his steady breathing gave her comfort. Ranger's recovery wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. He had been through so much, had been injured and exhausted, yet here he was, back by her side. She pressed her forehead against his, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll never let you go, Ranger. You saved me. You saved us. Ranger responded with a soft sigh, his eyes closing briefly as if in contentment. He wasn't fully recovered, and his body still bore the marks of the hardships he had faced, but in that moment he seemed to know that they had made it through. They had survived. The days after the confrontation with her father felt like a blur, but there was a subtle shift within Lila. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but bit by bit, as the storm outside quieted, so did the storm inside her. She began to notice the small things, the way the sun seemed brighter through the window now, how the warmth of the cabin felt more inviting, and how, despite everything, there was a small spark of hope starting to grow inside her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lila began to believe in a future. It was a future that wasn't defined by fear or pain, but by something new, something fragile, but full of possibility. Molly was safe, Ranger was recovering, and Alex, the man who had taken them in without hesitation, was beginning to feel like family. The sense of peace that settled over her wasn't just a temporary escape, it was a sign that healing had begun. Lila sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, the gentle crackling of the logs a soothing backdrop to the quiet that had settled over the cabin. Ranger, lying on the rug near her feet, had already taken his place as a comforting presence in the room, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed as he rested. His recovery had been slow but steady. Every day he was a little stronger, a little more alert, and in the quiet moments, Lila could see the bond between them growing even deeper. Ranger wasn't just a dog anymore. He was her protector, her friend, and now he was the symbol of the new life they were building. Across from her, Alex was cleaning his gear, the routine movements calming to watch. Since they had arrived, he'd kept his distance, patient, understanding, giving Lila the time she needed to process the trauma of the past. But now, the walls between them had begun to come down. The unspoken connection between them was evident in the way they shared space, in the quiet moments of understanding that passed between them without words. Alex was starting to feel like family, and for the first time, Lila realized how much she had longed for that sense of belonging. "I think it's time we start thinking about tomorrow," Alex said, suddenly breaking the silence. He had put down his gear and was looking at her now, his gaze steady. Lila met his eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were no longer running from their past. They were starting a new chapter, one filled with healing, with safety, and with the possibility of peace. Do you think we could really make a life here?" Lila's voice wavered with uncertainty, but there was something new in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. Alex smiled, a small, reassuring smile that touched his eyes. "I know we can." His voice was warm, full of conviction. "And Ranger and I are here every step of the way." Lila let the words sink in, her heart filling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It was so simple, so matter-of-fact, but in that moment it felt like the promise of a future. Ranger lifted his head and glanced at them both, his eyes full of understanding, as if he too knew that things had shifted. The journey they had started together, Ranger, Lila, and Alex, was only just beginning, but there was something about the way they were together now, something about the quiet bond they shared, that made it feel like they were already family, and that was the first step toward healing. As the night fell, Lila settled into the warmth of the cabin, Molly asleep in her arms, and Ranger still by her side. She felt the weight of the past finally start to lift, not all at once, but in small, steady moments that she could hold on to. She could see a future, one that was shaped not by fear, but by hope, by love, and by the family they were building together. The days slowly blended together as Lila, Molly, and Alex settled into their new routine. What had started as a terrifying escape from the storm, both literal and emotional, was now turning into something more, a fresh start, a second chance at life. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, was beginning to feel more like home with each passing day. Lila had never imagined that life could be peaceful again, but here, In this little cabin surrounded by the stillness of the snow-covered woods, there was a quiet comfort. There were no screams, no breaking glass, no fear creeping into every corner of the house. There was just the soft crackling of the fire, the steady rhythm of Molly's laughter, and the presence of Ranger, who never strayed far from them. Lila spent most of her days caring for Molly, the way she always had, but now it was different. Molly was no longer a baby in danger, but a child growing strong and confident in a safe environment. Each time Molly's tiny hand reached for hers, each time she smiled up at Lila, there was a sense of peace that filled Lila's heart, a quiet joy she had almost forgotten existed. There were moments of laughter too, soft and genuine. Alex, though still quiet at times, would find ways to make her smile, whether it was with a joke, a small gesture of kindness, or by sharing stories of his past life before becoming a police officer. Ranger, always the watchful protector, would quietly sit beside them, never far from either Lila or Molly. It was as though he knew deep within him that this was where they were meant to be, together, safe, whole, and loved. Every evening as the day's light waned, the three of them would gather by the fire, the warmth of their small world cocooning them in a sense of belonging. Ranger would rest his head in Lila's lap, his eyes heavy with sleep but still ever watchful. There was a comfort in his presence, a reminder of the journey they had all taken to get here, to this point of calm. For Lila, it was a chance to breathe. It wasn't just the safety of the cabin, nor the physical distance from her father's violence that gave her peace. It was the quiet acceptance of the family they were building together. Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, was more than just a dog now. He was part of their healing. Every nudge, every comforting sigh from him reminded Lila that no matter what, she wasn't alone. Alex, with his steady presence, was becoming more than a protector. He was becoming family. Mornings were quiet and gentle, with the sun filtering softly through the windows as Lila and Molly went about their day. Alex would take care of the small repairs around the house, checking the firewood and making sure everything was in order. Sometimes he would leave for short trips to town, but he always returned with something for them, whether it was food or just a friendly visit to check in on how they were doing. It was the small things that began to build the foundation of the life they were creating, piece by piece. But it was the evenings that were the most precious. When night fell, the world outside seemed to disappear. The cold wind could howl, the storm could rage, but inside the cabin, it was always warm. It was always safe. Ranger, ever loyal, would stay close, never straying too far from Lila or Molly. There were no more fears of the past creeping in, no more uncertainty. Lila began to realize that this was the life she had always wanted for herself and Molly, one where love and safety were constant, not fleeting, and where the bonds between them were unbreakable. They had come so far from the chaos of their former life, and now they were starting to rebuild. The scars of their past wouldn't fade overnight, but hope had begun to replace the fear. Molly was thriving in the security they had found, and Lila was finding her own peace, her own strength. Alex, Ranger, and Molly were her family now, and nothing could take that away. As the days passed, Lila and Molly began to sense the transformation around them. The steady rhythm of life in the cabin, once foreign to them, had become a source of peace, a gentle ebb and flow that soothed the scars they carried from their past. The warmth of the fire, the quiet moments shared together, the soft rustle of the trees outside, it all blended into a new kind of comfort. Lila found herself waking with a quiet hope that had long been absent. She would stir in the mornings, and for the first time in years, the weight on her chest had lifted. She looked down at Molly, who was now playing happily by the hearth, her face flushed with health and joy. Molly's laughter was like music, clear and unburdened, a reminder of the innocence that had survived despite everything they had endured. It was a sound Lila had longed for, a sound that reminded her of the future they were now building together. Alex played his part in this new life too. His quiet presence, His steady hands and his constant care had shown Lila what it meant to be loved in a way that didn't hurt, a love that didn't come with strings or conditions. He had never expected anything in return for his help. There were no demands, no strings attached. His acts of kindness, whether it was fixing a broken window or making sure there was enough firewood, were just that, acts of care. Through his actions, Lila saw what a true family could look like. But the one who had truly healed their wounds was Ranger. He was always there, a constant presence that reminded them both of what it meant to be loved unconditionally. Ranger had been their protector from the very beginning. Even in his old age, his spirit had never faltered. The dog had guided them through darkness and fear, had kept them safe, and had risked his life for them. Ranger wasn't just a pet, he was a hero. The dog had stood between them and the dangers of their past and had never backed down, not once. Lila would catch herself staring at Ranger from time to time, his graying muzzle, his weary eyes, and his body, which was slowly healing but still showing the marks of their long journey. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. He had saved them, he had kept them safe when no one else could. He had been their rock, their anchor. And now, as he lay beside her, content but still watchful, Lila realized just how much he had shaped their lives. One evening after Molly had fallen asleep, Lila sat by the fire, Ranger at her feet. Alex was sitting across from her, cleaning his boots after a long day outside. The soft glow of the fire reflected in their eyes, and for a moment everything felt still. There was no fear, no uncertainty, just a quiet understanding between them all. Ranger was the reason we made it here, Lila said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was thick with emotion, the weight of her words finally breaking through. Alex looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "He's the reason you're safe now," he agreed softly, "and the reason you found your way back to hope." Lila nodded, her throat tight. She looked down at Ranger, who was now curled up by the fire, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog had given them everything he had, without question, without hesitation. He had been the hero of their story. In that moment, Lila felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for Ranger, but for everything that had led her here. She had survived. They had survived. They had found something worth fighting for again. Her family was no longer defined by fear or loss. It was defined by the love and loyalty that bound them together. Ranger, Alex, and Molly, they were her family. And nothing would ever take that away from her. A new day dawned, soft light creeping through the windows of the cabin. The world outside had been washed clean by the storm, the snow sparkling like a fresh canvas awaiting the first strokes of color. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of Molly waking up. Lila rose from her bed, stretching, feeling the pull of muscles that had begun to relax after days of constant tension. The past had weighed heavily on her, but today felt different. The fear that had once been a constant companion, clinging to her like a shadow, was beginning to fade. She glanced over at Molly, who was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes, a smile tugging at her lips as she reached for her stuffed bear. "Good morning, little one," Lila whispered, her voice warm with affection. Molly beamed up at her, the joy in her eyes a clear sign of the safety they had found. It was the kind of joy Lila had almost forgotten existed, a happiness that wasn't born out of survival, but out of the simple beauty of being alive, together, in a place where they could finally heal. Ranger was already up, his tail wagging lazily as he padded over to Lila. The dog had taken his place by the door, ever watchful, ever protective, but there was something different about him now. His movements were slower, more deliberate, but his eyes shone with the same unwavering loyalty that had kept them going. Ranger had always been their guardian, but now he seemed to embody something even more profound, a quiet wisdom, the understanding that they had made it through the worst. And now it was time to start anew. Alex was outside, chopping wood to keep the fire going. The rhythmic sound of the axe against the wood echoed in the stillness of the morning. Lila couldn't help but smile at the sight of him. His broad shoulders, the way his face seemed to soften when he caught sight of Molly laughing. He had become such a steady presence in their lives, a constant source of strength and kindness. It wasn't just about protecting them anymore, it was about building a life. When Alex came inside, his eyes met Lila's, and there was a quiet understanding between them. The bond they were forming wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about something more. They were becoming a family, and the changes in Alex were becoming evident. Alex had been alone for a long time, consumed by his own grief and loss. The pain of losing his wife and son had left a void in him that he didn't know how to fill. But now, with Lila and Molly in his life, he was starting to feel something he hadn't in years: hope. It wasn't just the satisfaction of helping them, of doing the right thing. It was the quiet joy of having a purpose again, of knowing that the future wasn't something to fear, but something to build. As Alex hung up his coat by the door and sat down to join them, Lila noticed the change in him. He seemed lighter, more at peace. It wasn't just the physical labor, the repairs he'd made around the cabin, or even the daily routines that kept him busy. It was the emotional shift. Alex had begun to find joy again, in the little moments, in the everyday things that had once seemed so mundane. Lila could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at Molly, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. He was beginning to let go of the grief that had consumed him for so long. "I think we're going to be okay, Lila," Alex said, his voice steady and warm as he looked at her. "You're safe now. You and Molly are going to be okay." Lila smiled at him, her heart full of the gratitude she didn't always know how to express. "Thank you for everything." And for the first time in so long, Lila felt like the weight of her past was finally lifting. They were starting a new chapter, one built on love, trust, and the promise of a future that was no longer defined by fear. Ranger, always by her side, let out a contented sigh as though he too knew that the worst was behind them, and for the first time in her life, Lila believed it too. They were building a future. The day they moved into the new house, the sun shone brightly through the trees, casting long shadows across the freshly cleared driveway. Alex, Lila, Molly, and Ranger stood outside, taking in the sight of their new home. It was modest, nothing extravagant, just a small, comfortable house with a few acres of land and a wraparound porch that overlooked a vast stretch of forest. It was the kind of home that felt peaceful, a place where they could start fresh, without the ghosts of the past hanging over them. Lila stood at the front door, holding Molly in her arms. She couldn't believe they were finally here, away from the storm, away from the fear, away from the life that had trapped her and her sister for so long. The house, though simple, felt like a sanctuary. It was everything they needed and more. The familiar scent of fresh paint and new wood filled the air as they entered the house. Ranger trotted in first, his tail wagging as he explored the space. His movements were slower now, his age showing in the way he limped a little, but there was no hesitation in the dog's steps. He was ready to protect his family just as he always had. "This is it," Alex said, standing beside Lila, looking out the window at the forest that stretched beyond. "This is our new beginning." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had been running from the past for so long, but now it felt like the first time she could breathe easy. The weight of everything that had happened, her father, the abuse, the years of fear, began to lift, slowly but surely. It was a new chapter, a fresh start, and she was ready to embrace it. Ranger came over and sat down beside Lila, his eyes still watchful, as if ensuring everything was in its place. He had always been her protector, the steady presence that had never faltered. Now, in this new home, Ranger was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of everything they had survived, and everything they were about to build. As the days passed, Lila and Molly began to settle into their new routine. There was no longer the looming shadow of her father's anger, no more hiding in fear. They spent their days in simple joy, walking through the woods, playing in the yard, and enjoying the quiet beauty of the world around them. Lila had never known peace like this. For the first time in years, she felt like she could relax, like she could truly be herself. Alex, too, found comfort in the simplicity of their new life. He spent his days fixing up the house, repairing the fence, clearing out the garden, and making sure everything was in order. It was work, but it was the kind of work that didn't weigh on his heart. There was no guilt, no grief to carry anymore. He was finally starting to let go of the pain he had carried for so long. And each time he saw Lila and Molly laughing, he felt a sense of hope stir in his chest. They were healing. In the evenings, they would all gather in the living room. The fire would crackle in the hearth, and Ranger would curl up at Lila's feet, his head resting on her lap as she ran her fingers through his fur. It was the same routine they had come to cherish, but now it felt more like a family built not on blood but on love and loyalty. The nights were peaceful, too. Lila would fall asleep knowing that she was safe, knowing that Ranger was there to protect them, just as he always had been. Alex would be there too, a steady presence beside her, someone who had become more than a stranger. They had become a team, a family. The transformation was real. They had started over, left the darkness behind, and embraced the light of a new life. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Lila knew they could face whatever came their way. As the days turned into weeks, Lila felt a transformation deep within herself. The girl who had once cowered in fear, the girl who had spent years hiding from the world, was slowly being replaced by someone stronger, more confident, someone who had learned how to stand tall in the face of adversity. The weight of her past still lingered in her heart, but it no longer defined her. Lila began to embrace the changes that came with her new life. She was no longer just surviving. She was starting to truly live again. Each day, she spent time outside with Molly, teaching her to climb trees, pick wildflowers, and enjoy the simple joys of life. Molly, who had been so small and fragile when they first arrived, was growing stronger with every passing day. Her laughter, once a rare sound, now filled the house regularly, and Lila's heart swelled with pride as she watched her little sister blossom. She had always felt a deep sense of responsibility for Molly, but now it was more than that. Lila was beginning to see herself not just as a protector, but as a guide, someone who could show Molly what it meant to be brave, to be kind, to be strong. The world was no longer a place to be feared. It was a place full of possibility. One afternoon, as they were walking through the woods, Lila looked down at Molly, who was skipping along beside her, and smiled. Molly was no longer the frightened, wide-eyed baby that had clung to her for dear life. She was a little girl now, strong and confident, with a sense of wonder and curiosity that was a joy to witness. "I think we're finally okay, Molly," Lila whispered to her sister as she reached out to hold her hand. Molly looked up at her with bright, trusting eyes, her little fingers curling around Lila's. "I know," she said softly. "I feel safe." Lila felt a warmth fill her chest, a feeling of pure gratitude for everything they had found here. The safety, the love, the peace that had once seemed impossible. Back at the cabin, Ranger was there, as always. The dog had become more than just a protector. He was part of their family, part of their healing. Ranger's loyalty and unwavering presence had given them the strength they needed to rebuild their lives. Lila couldn't imagine a world without him by her side. As time passed, Alex and Ranger became constants in their lives, two figures of stability and comfort. Alex, who had once been consumed by his grief, was now fully part of their family. His transformation was just as evident as Lila's. He smiled more, laughed more, and was able to find joy in the small things, like watching Molly chase after Ranger in the yard or sharing a quiet evening with Lila by the fire. Lila noticed that Alex looked at her differently now, with a kind of pride in his eyes. It wasn't just about keeping them safe anymore. Alex had become part of their journey too, a guiding hand in their new life. He had given them more than just protection. He had given them a sense of belonging, a future they could trust. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lila sat on the porch watching Molly run through the yard, laughing as Ranger chased after her. She could feel the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a sense of peace she had never known. She had found strength in the most unlikely places, in the kindness of Alex, in the loyalty of Ranger, and in the resilience of her own heart. Molly joined her on the porch, sitting beside her with a contented sigh. "Lila," she said, looking up at her big sister, "I love it here. I love our new home." Lila smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Molly's face. "Me too, Molly. Me too." For the first time, Lila felt the weight of her past truly begin to dissolve. She wasn't just healing, she was moving forward. And with Molly and Ranger and Alex by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face together. As the days grew shorter and the crisp air of December settled over the cabin, Lila found herself looking out over the snow-covered yard, reflecting on how far they had come. The shadows of the past were no longer looming over her, replaced instead by a calm peace she had once believed was unattainable. She and Molly had started a new life, one that was filled with laughter, love, and a sense of belonging they had never known before. The holidays were approaching, and with them, a new sense of hope. The first Christmas in their new home was fast approaching, and the house was already beginning to feel festive. Lila had hung homemade decorations in the windows, and they'd set up a small tree by the fire, its twinkling lights casting a warm glow over the room. Molly had insisted on making paper snowflakes, which now decorated the walls, each one a symbol of their fresh start, a mark of new memories being created. But more than the decorations, more than the lights, the real gift of the season was the family they had become. Alex, once a stranger, now seemed like a permanent fixture in their lives. He had transformed from a man consumed by grief into a man who found joy in their small, everyday moments. He had become a father figure to Lila and Molly, someone who not only protected them but loved them with all his heart. His presence in their lives had filled a void they hadn't known how to fill. Ranger, though not as spry as he once was still the same loyal dog who had walked them through the darkest times. He was their protector, their constant companion, and now he seemed content in the knowledge that he had given his all for his family. Each day his tired eyes watched over Lila and Molly, his loyalty unwavering, and in return, they gave him love, care, and a quiet place to rest, where he could heal from the battles he had fought for them. On Christmas Eve, Lila, Molly, and Alex sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames filling the room. Ranger lay at their feet, his head resting on Lila's lap as she gently stroked his fur. The glow of the tree's lights flickered softly, casting shadows that danced around them like memories. "It's beautiful," Molly said, her small voice full of wonder as she gazed at the lights on the tree. "This is our best Christmas ever." Lila smiled, her heart full. It was a simple Christmas, nothing extravagant, but it was everything they needed. It was the beginning of their journey together, a journey not defined by fear or loss, but by the love and hope they had found in each other. "It's perfect," Lila whispered, glancing at Alex. He smiled back at her, his eyes filled with warmth and pride. He had become the father figure she hadn't known she needed, and now she couldn't imagine life without him. They were a family, Lila, Molly, Ranger, and Alex together, strong and unbreakable. The storm of the past had passed, and now they were moving forward, embracing the future with open arms. As midnight approached, Lila stepped outside onto the porch, taking a deep breath of the cold winter air. The world was still, silent, as the first snowflakes of Christmas Eve fell softly from the sky. Lila looked up at the stars. the same stars her mother had once looked up at. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. The love she had carried with her through the darkest days of her life was now around her, in the faces of the people she had come to call family. She had found hope, and in that hope, she had found her way back to herself. "Happy Christmas, Mom," she whispered, her voice carrying the wind. "We made it, and we're going to be okay." She smiled as Ranger padded over to her, nuzzling her side. She didn't need to say anything more. The bond between them said it all. The family they had created was built on love, loyalty, and the unbreakable ties that had held them together through everything. And as Alex and Molly joined her on the porch, Lila knew that this was just the beginning. Their journey, filled with hope and possibility, was only starting. Together, they would face whatever came next. In the quiet moments of life, it's easy to forget the simple truths that animals teach us every day. Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, showed us that love is not always about words or grand gestures. Sometimes love is the quiet presence that stays by your side, no matter how dark the days become. His unwavering loyalty, his courage in the face of danger, and his deep, unconditional love remind us of the purest form of companionship. German shepherds are more than just dogs. They are guardians, friends, and family. They teach us about sacrifice, about standing firm when life feels uncertain, and about showing love even in the toughest times. Their hearts are bound by loyalty, a loyalty that never fades, even as they grow old and weary. In Ranger's eyes, Lila and Molly found more than protection. They found a love that transcended everything they had been through. Ranger's presence was a constant reminder that true love isn't about expecting something in return, but about giving your all, without hesitation, without question. As the years go by, the bond between a dog and their family only grows stronger. And in the end, it is that love, the quiet, steadfast, unconditional love that helps us heal, find hope, and move forward no matter what comes next. Ranger's story is a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the quiet strength that animals give to us all.